Hello everyone. So the next topic which we will be discussing is about the blood brain. So this is considered as a brain barrier. So in this what we will be studying is we will be studying the functions of the brain barrier. Then we will be studying about the structure and what is actually blood brain barrier and why do we need it. So we will be studying these topics in detail. Now, the brain, which is precious, and evolution has gone to great lengths to protect it from the damage. So the most obvious is our 7 mm thick skull, but the brain is surrounded by a protective fluid and a protective membrane. So both of them provide a defense against the physical injury. So another protective element is the blood-brain barrier, which we will be discussing. So as the name suggests, blood-brain barrier, this is a barrier between the blood vessels and the cells and other components that make up the brain tissues. So whereas the skull, the cerebrospinal fluid, they protect against the physical damage, but the blood-brain barrier, it provides the defense. What it does it provides the defense against diseases. What it do is it provides defense against the diseases. So causing pathogens and toxins that may be present in our blood. So if I come to the definition of what is the blood-brain barrier, then it is a diffusion barrier which impedes influx of most organs from the blood to the brain. So there are three cellular elements of the brain microvasculature which composed of the blood-brain barrier. So here, wherever there is written BBB, that only means that we are talking about the blood-brain barrier. So we are talking about the blood-brain barrier. So there are three cells which are being depicted here. So the blood-brain barrier, it was being discovered in the late 19th century when there was a German physician, Paul Ehrlich. He injected a dye into the bloodstream to a mouse. So to his surprise, the dye infiltrated all the tissues except the brain and the spinal cord. While this showed that a barrier which existed between the brain and the blood, it wasn't until the 1960. The researchers, they used the microscopes which is powerful enough to determine the physical layer of the blood-brain barrier. Now, if I talk about the structure of the blood-brain barrier, then often barrier is the endothelial tight junctions. So what is it? It is the endothelial tight junctions. So endothelial cells line the interior of all the blood vessels and in the capillaries that form the blood-brain barrier. They are endothelial cells which are wedged extremely close to each other, forming so-called tight junctions. So they form the tight junction. So there is a tight gap which allows only small molecules. For example, there can be fat soluble molecules and some gases to pass freely through the capillary wall and to the brain tissues. Capillary wall to the brain tissue. So there are some larger molecules. What are the larger molecules? So there are some larger molecules, for example, glucose, which can gain entry through the transporter proteins, which acts like a special door that opens only for the particular molecules. So surrounding the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, there are other components of the blood-brain barrier that aren't strictly involved in stopping things getting from blood to brain, but which communicate with the cells that form the barrier to change how selective the blood-brain barrier is. Now, importance of the blood-brain barrier is there is a water-soluble substance, as I have already talked about, which is a glucose. So that cross the blood-brain barrier by active transport. And there are other substances as well, which are creatinine, urea, and most ions which cross the blood-brain barrier very slowly. And still there are some substances like proteins and other antibiotic drugs which do not pass at all from the blood to the brain tissues. So the question is, why do we need it? The purpose of the blood-brain barrier is to protect against the circulating toxins or pathogens that could cause brain infections, while at the same time it will allow the vital nutrients to reach the brain. Its other functions is to help the maintain relatively constant level of hormones, nutrients, and water in the brain. Fluctuations in which could disrupt the finely tuned environment. So this was about the importance. Then comes the iron regulation. So the blood-brain barrier is basically they provide a stable environment for the neural function. So there are neural functions which are continuously going on, but they provide the stable environment also. The combination of specific ion channels and transporters, they keep the ionic composition optimal for synaptic signaling functioning. And there are neurotransmitters which consist of the CNS, the PNS, which use many of the same neurotransmitters, the BBB, which also keeps the central and peripheral transmitters pools separate and minimizing the crosstalk. And it also prevents many macromolecules from entering the brain. So if the blood-brain barrier, for example, is damaged or somehow compromised, then what will happen? So one common way this occurs is through bacterial infection. So that is the bacterial infection is the meningococcal disease. So it can bind to the endothelial wall, causing the tight junctions to open slightly, and as a result the blood-brain barrier becomes more porous, allowing bacteria and other toxins to infect the brain tissue, so which can lead to inflammation and sometimes it leads to death. So it is also thought that the blood-brain barrier function can decrease for in other conditions. For example, in multiple sclerosis, for example, there is a defective blood-brain barrier which allows the white blood cells to infiltrate the brain and attack the functions that sends the messages from one brain cell to another. So this causes problems with how neurons signal with each other. Then the functions of the blood-brain barrier, which actively protects the brain. First of all, it will actively protects the brain from circulating pathogens. Accordingly, it will protect the brain from the infections, brain infections. So blood-borne infections of the brain are rare. So infections of the brain that do occur are often difficult to treat. So the antibodies which are too large to cross the blood-brain barrier. And there are only certain antibiotics which are able to pass. So in some of the cases, a drug has to be administered directly into the cerebrospinal fluid, where it can enter the brain by crossing the blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. So this is about the blood-brain barrier. These are some of the references. Thank you.